"Sir, you can't stand here," the man in the tailored charcoal suit said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of arriving guests, and for a moment, everything at the church entrance seemed to pause as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The white marble steps stretching wide under the soft afternoon sun, polished so clean they reflected fragments of sky and passing heels. The scent of fresh roses drifting from carefully arranged bouquets tied to each column, ribbons swaying gently in the light breeze, everything prepared down to the smallest detail for a wedding that was meant to be perfect, flawless, untouched by anything that didn't belong. And yet just off to the side, near the wrought iron gate, stood Samuel Whitaker, his shoulders slightly hunched, his coat worn thin at the elbows, the fabric faded from years of weather and time, his shoes scuffed and uneven against the smooth stone, one laced loosely, dragging as if it had given up trying to hold together, and in his trembling hands, he held a single piece of paper, folded and unfolded so many times that its edges had softened, the ink faintly smudged but still legible, the name at the center catching the light every time his fingers shifted, Olivia Whitaker, printed in elegant script that didn't seem to belong in his world. His eyes fixed on the tall wooden doors of the church as they opened and closed with the arrival of guests dressed in press suits and flowing dresses, laughter echoing in brief bursts before being swallowed by the grand space inside. He didn't move forward, didn't step onto the main path, just stood there like a shadow that refused to disappear, unnoticed by most, ignored by many, until Charles Bennett noticed him, because Charles noticed everything that didn't fit, everything that threatened the image he had built so carefully over the years. Every wrinkle, every misplaced detail, every disruption to order. And Samuel was all of those things at once, a presence that didn't match the polished perfection of the moment. Charles adjusted his cufflinks with a small, precise motion, his gaze narrowing slightly as he took in the scene, the contrast almost offensive to him, and when he walked over, his steps were measured, controlled, the kind of walk that carried authority without needing to raise a voice, stopping just short of Samuel as if an invisible line separated them, the kind of line that wasn't drawn on the ground but lived in people's minds. "This is a private event," Charles added, his tone firm now, not loud, but final, as though the decision had already been made before Samuel had even spoken, and Samuel's fingers tightened around the paper, the soft crinkle barely audible under the distant sound of a piano beginning to play inside the church, a slow, elegant melody that seemed to belong to another world entirely. His lips parted slightly, hesitation lingering in the small space between breath and words, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something older than the moment. Quieter than the music but heavier than the silence. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. Eyes still on the door, not on Charles, as if looking directly might break something fragile inside him. "I just wanted to see her." And the breeze shifted again, lifting the corner of the paper just enough for the name to show once more, the sunlight catching it briefly like a signal no one else was looking for, while around them, guests continued to pass, some glancing, most not, the world moving forward in smooth, uninterrupted motion, leaving Samuel standing at the edge of it, holding on to something that refused to let him walk away. Samuel Whitaker did not look at Charles Bennett when the words settled between them. He simply stood there with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that sudden movements could make things worse, his breathing slow but uneven as if each inhale carried a memory he could not quite put down, the paper in his hands trembling slightly again, not from the breeze this time but from something deeper. Something that had followed him for years through bus stations, park benches, and long nights under flickering streetlights. And yet his eyes never left those tall wooden doors as another group of guests stepped inside, their polished shoes clicking softly against the marble, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation and celebration, a world moving forward without hesitation, while he remained just outside its edge, holding on to a moment he was not sure he would ever be allowed to enter, and Charles watched him with a growing impatience that showed not in his voice but in the tightening of his jaw. The subtle shift of his posture, as he adjusted his stance like a man correcting a detail that did not belong, his gaze flicking briefly to the arriving guests, making sure no one of importance was paying too much attention, because reputation was not something he allowed to slip, not here, Not on a day like this, not with donors and families and carefully curated expectations filling every corner of the church grounds. "You need to move along," Charles said again, quieter this time but more direct, the kind of tone that expected obedience without question, and still Samuel did not move, his thumb brushing absent-mindedly over the edge of the invitation, tracing the letters as if grounding himself in something real, something that proved he was not mistaken, that he had not imagined it, that he had not traveled across 3 states on buses that smelled of diesel and stale coffee just to stand here and be told to leave, his lips parting again before he spoke, the words coming slower now, deliberate, careful. "Her name is Olivia Whitaker," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for Charles to hear, and for the first time, Charles's eyes dropped to the paper in Samuel's hands, really seeing it, not just the worn edges but the name printed there, the same name written on the schedule he had checked a dozen times that morning, the same name embossed on the programs stacked neatly inside the entrance, the same name that had been repeated in every instruction, every rehearsal, every final detail leading up to this moment. And something flickered across his expression, not recognition exactly, but a brief hesitation, quickly masked by the return of control, because coincidences happened, and people lied, and stories were told every day to gain sympathy, to cross boundaries, to step into places where they did not belong, and Charles had built his position on knowing the difference, on keeping order, on making sure nothing disrupted the image that had been promised, and so he straightened again, his voice firm once more. "That does not change anything," he replied, his eyes lifting back to Samuel's face, searching for something that would confirm his judgment, something that would make this simple. But Samuel did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not step forward, he simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he had already expected, and then he did something small, almost unnoticeable. He unfolded the paper completely, smoothing it out with both hands despite the creases that refused to disappear, holding it just slightly higher, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in quiet insistence, like a man holding on to the last piece of proof he had left, and for a moment, the light shifted again, catching the ink in a way that made the name stand out against everything else. And Charles felt that brief flicker return, sharper this time, not doubt exactly, but something close to it, something he did not like, something that threatened the clean lines of certainty he preferred, and behind them, the music inside the church grew fuller, the notes rising as if signaling that something important was about to begin, time moving forward whether they were ready or not, and still Samuel stood there, unmoving, patient in a way that did not demand attention but refused to disappear, as if the moment itself was waiting for someone else to notice what Charles was trying so hard to ignore. Charles Bennett had spent years learning how to read a room before anyone else could, how to anticipate disruptions before they fully formed, and how to correct them with minimal attention, because in his world control was not about force but about perception, about keeping everything aligned so that nothing questioned the illusion of perfection. And yet, as he stood there facing Samuel Whitaker, something refused to settle into place. Something small but persistent, like a loose thread he could not quite pull free, and it irritated him more than he was willing to admit, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took a longer look at the man in front of him, not just the worn coat or the tired posture but the way Samuel held himself, not aggressive, not pleading, simply present in a way that did not match the usual patterns Charles had come to expect, and that difference made it harder to dismiss him, harder to categorize him into something easy to remove. And for a brief moment Charles glanced back toward the church doors again, watching as a pair of bridesmaids stepped inside, their soft laughter trailing behind them, the white fabric of their dresses catching the light in a way that seemed almost unreal, everything inside moving forward with precision and beauty, everything outside carefully managed so that nothing interfered, and yet here was this man, standing just beyond the threshold, holding on to a name that belonged to that world but carrying none of its appearance, none of its expected form. And Charles felt that tension sharpen, the need to resolve it quickly before it grew into something visible, something others might begin to notice, because attention was dangerous when it landed on the wrong detail. "You cannot stay here," he said again, this time more clearly, each word placed with intention, as if speaking them firmly enough would restore the order he was used to, and still Samuel did not argue. He only lowered his gaze briefly to the invitation in his hands, his thumb pressing gently over the printed letters as if memorizing them one last time, his voice softer now when he spoke, but steadier. "I know how this looks," he said, almost apologetic. "I know I do not belong in a place like this." And there was no bitterness in his tone, no accusation, just a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to carry years of experience behind it, years of being told the same thing in different ways, in different places, by different people, and Charles felt that flicker again, stronger now, because this was not resistance, this was not confrontation, this was something else, something that did not fit the usual script, and for a second he hesitated, just enough for the silence between them to stretch longer than it should have, the sound of the piano inside growing fuller now, joined by the faint murmur of voices settling into place, the ceremony drawing closer with each passing moment, and Samuel lifted his eyes again, not with urgency but with a kind of quiet hope that seemed almost out of place in the setting. "I will not go inside," he added, as if offering a compromise that had not been asked for. "I will stand right here. I will not speak to anyone. I just want to see her walk down the aisle." And the words hung there simple and heavy at the same time, and for the first time Charles noticed something he had missed before, the way Samuel's hand tightened slightly at the mention of that moment, the way his shoulders straightened just a fraction, not in defiance but in anticipation, as if that single image held more meaning than anything else, and it unsettled him, because it introduced something he could not measure. Something that did not respond to authority or structure, and behind them a car door closed somewhere. Along the curb, drawing a few glances from nearby guests, a subtle shift in attention that made Charles instinctively step closer to Samuel, lowering his voice again, more controlled now, more deliberate. "This is not about what you want," he said, the edge returning to his tone, because control required clarity, and clarity required boundaries. "This is a private ceremony, and I am responsible for keeping it that way." And Samuel nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer all along, his gaze drifting once more toward the doors, his lips pressing together for a brief second before relaxing again, and then he said something so quiet it almost blended into the breeze. "I was responsible once too." And the words lingered there, not explained, not expanded, just offered like a fragment of a life that no longer matched the present, and Charles felt that thread tighten again, pulling at something beneath the surface of his certainty, because for a moment, just a moment, the man in front of him did not look like an interruption. He looked like someone who had been part of something once, something important enough to still be standing here now, refusing to leave, and that realization, however brief, made everything just a little harder to ignore. The moment lingered longer than it should have, stretching thin between expectation and interruption, and Charles Bennett felt it clearly now, the subtle shift in the rhythm of the day, the kind of shift that did not announce itself loudly but crept in quietly, threatening to unravel something carefully arranged, and he did not like it, not here, not now, not when everything had been timed down to the minute, the ceremony about to begin. The guests seated, the music building toward its cue, and yet here stood Samuel Whittaker, unmoving, holding on to a moment that refused to pass, and Charles exhaled slowly, not out of patience but out of calculation, as if choosing his next move with precision would restore the balance he needed, his voice lowering further, controlled but firmer now. "You are creating a scene," he said, even though no one had raised their voice, even though the space around them remained quiet, because sometimes the idea of a disruption was enough to justify removing it, and Samuel shook his head gently, almost immediately, the motion small but certain. "No, sir," he replied, his tone respectful, steady. "I am trying not to." And that answer landed differently than Charles expected, not defensive, not emotional, just honest in a way that made it harder to dismiss, and for a brief second Charles glanced again toward the church doors, noticing the ushers beginning to guide the last few guests inside, the aisle now nearly ready, the timing tightening, everything moving forward without room for delay, and he knew he could not allow anything to interfere, not even something as quiet as this, because quiet things had a way of becoming louder if left unchecked. "You have already stayed too long," Charles said, stepping slightly closer, his presence more direct now, creating a boundary that had not been there before, and Samuel did not step back, did not retreat, but he did lower his hands just a little, the invitation now resting against his coat instead of being held up, as if protecting it rather than presenting it, his gaze still drifting toward the doors where light continued to spill out onto the marble steps. "I came early so I would not be in the way," he said, almost as if explaining a plan that had been carefully thought through. "I stood by the gate, I did not speak to anyone, I waited until most people were inside." And as he spoke, there was a quiet logic in his words, a sequence that revealed intention rather than accident, and Charles felt that thread tighten again, because this was not random, this was not careless, this was deliberate, and deliberate things carried weight, and he did not have time to examine that weight, not today, not with everything else depending on his control, and so he straightened once more, drawing a clear line with his tone. "Intentions do not change the outcome," he replied, his words crisp, final. "You cannot stay here." And for a moment, Samuel said nothing, the silence settling between them again, heavier this time, the music inside the church shifting into a higher register, signaling that the ceremony was moments away, and Samuel's eyes softened slightly, not with defeat but with something else, something that looked like acceptance layered over something deeper, and then he took a small breath, steadying himself before speaking again. "I was not invited to sit," he said quietly. "I know that." And his fingers tightened once more around the edge of the paper, the creases pressing deeper into his skin. "But I was not turned away either." And that sentence lingered, simple but pointed, and Charles felt it land in a place he could not immediately dismiss, because it introduced a gap, a space between rules and reality that he had not accounted for, and for a fraction of a second he hesitated again, the certainty in his posture shifting just enough to be felt, not seen, and behind them the doors opened wider, a wave of light spilling across the steps as someone inside signaled that it was time. The beginning of something that could not be paused, and Samuel's gaze lifted fully now, drawn to that light, to that moment he had been waiting for, his entire posture changing in a subtle but unmistakable way, as if everything in him was focused on what was about to happen, and Charles saw it, saw the weight of it, the quiet urgency, the restrained hope, and it made the situation more complicated than he wanted it to be, because removing a disruption was easy when it felt like a disruption, but this did not feel the same anymore, and that difference, however small, was enough to make everything just a little harder to control. The music swelled inside the church, rising with a quiet authority that signaled the ceremony had begun, the first notes of the processional echoing softly through the open doors and spilling onto the marble steps, and for a brief moment everything outside seemed to hold its place as if the world itself was pausing in respect for what was unfolding within. But Charles Bennet did not pause, because he could feel the window closing, the moment slipping away, and with it the chance to resolve what stood in front of him, and he could not allow uncertainty to remain, not when everything depended on precision, not when every detail had to align. And so he made his decision, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a tightening of control, his voice lowering again but carrying a firmness that left little room for interpretation. "This is your last chance to step away," he said, each word deliberate, measured, final, and Samuel Whitaker stood there, listening, his eyes still fixed on the doorway where the light moved in rhythm with the figures passing through it, his fingers pressing gently into the folded invitation as if anchoring himself to something real, something that could not be taken away. And when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not challenge, it simply held steady. "I am not asking to go inside," he repeated, the same quiet truth he had offered before, unchanged, unembellished. "I will stay out here." And that was when the tension reached its peak, not through volume or motion, but through stillness, through the refusal of one man to leave and the refusal of another to allow him to stay. And Charles felt it clearly now, the weight of eyes beginning to shift, a guest lingering a second too long near the entrance, a whisper carried just slightly further than intended, attention gathering at the edges, and that was what he could not permit. Because once attention settled, control weakened, and once control weakened, everything else could follow, and so he stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough to make his presence undeniable, his tone sharpening, no longer patient, no longer negotiable. "You do not understand," he said, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to Samuel or to himself. "This is not about you." And Samuel nodded slowly, accepting the words without resistance, without argument, but his feet did not move, his position unchanged, his gaze unwavering, and that quiet persistence became the breaking point, not because it was loud, but because it could not be redirected, and Charles felt that final thread snap, the thin line between control and reaction giving way to something more immediate, something less calculated, and the space between them shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but enough for the balance to break. Enough for the moment to tip, and Samuel's hand loosened just slightly, the invitation slipping from his fingers, drifting downward in a slow, almost weightless motion until it touched the marble below, landing open, the name visible once again against the pale stone, and for a second, no one spoke, the music inside continuing, untouched, uninterrupted, while outside the silence deepened, thick and unmistakable, the kind of silence that follows something that cannot be undone. And Samuel did not react the way Charles expected. He did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not demand anything. He simply looked down at the paper at his feet, his shoulders still, his expression unchanged except for a faint shift in his eyes, something softer now, something that carried a quiet ache rather than anger, and slowly, carefully, he bent just slightly, not all the way, just enough to reach for the edge of the invitation, his fingers brushing the marble as he lifted it again, smoothing it once more as if restoring it mattered, as if keeping it intact was the only thing he could still control, and when he straightened, he did not look at Charles, he looked back toward the doors, toward the light, toward the moment that was already beginning without him. And in that instant, the contrast became undeniable, not between two men, but between two kinds of strength, one rooted in authority, the other in endurance, and the silence that followed did not belong to either of them, it belonged to the truth that had not yet been spoken but was already beginning to take shape. The silence did not break right away, it lingered, stretching across the marble steps like a thin layer of frost, quiet but impossible to ignore, and for the first time since the morning began, Charles Bennet did not speak, because something in the moment resisted being filled, something in the way Samuel Whittaker stood there, holding that worn invitation with both hands now, steadying it as if it carried more than ink and paper. As if it carried years, distance, and something fragile that had survived far longer than anyone expected, and the music inside continued, soft and deliberate, the kind of melody that guided footsteps down an aisle lined with expectation, each note measured, each pause intentional, and Samuel listened, not with his ears alone but with his entire posture, his shoulders lifting just slightly with each rise in the music, his breath slowing to match its rhythm. As if he had been waiting for this exact sequence, this exact sound, and for a brief moment. Everything else seemed to fall away, the guests, the polished stone, the presence of Charles just a few feet away, all of it fading into the background while the doorway became the only thing that mattered, lights spilling out in a steady glow, shifting with the movement inside, revealing fragments of white fabric, the edge of a veil, the soft outline of figures preparing for something sacred, and Samuel did not step forward. Did not cross the invisible line that had been drawn for him. He simply stood where he was, honoring it in a way that required no words, and Charles noticed that, noticed the restraint, the discipline in the stillness, and it unsettled him more than defiance would have, because it left no clear justification, no obvious reason to act, and yet the tension remained, because the situation itself had not changed, and Charles found himself caught in that space between what he had decided and what he was now witnessing, his gaze drifting briefly to the invitation again, the name still visible, still undeniable, and then back to Samuel's face, searching for something that would resolve the conflict cleanly, something that would allow him to return to certainty. But it did not come, and the longer he stood there, the more the moment expanded, filling the space with something heavier than either of them had expected, and then the music shifted again, a subtle change but unmistakable, the signal that the bride was about to appear, and a ripple moved through the air, felt more than heard, a quiet anticipation that reached even the steps outside, and Samuel's fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the paper, not enough to crease it further, just enough to hold it in place, his eyes fixed now, unblinking, as if he could not risk missing a single second, and in that stillness, something in his expression softened, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something deeper, something that carried both pride and pain in equal measure, and it showed in the smallest details, the way his jaw relaxed, the way his shoulders settled, the way his entire presence seemed to center itself on that doorway. And Charles saw it, saw the shift, saw the weight of it, and for a moment, his own certainty faltered, not completely, not enough to undo his position, but enough to introduce a question he had not allowed before, and it lingered there, quiet but persistent, pressing against the edges of his control, and neither of them moved, either of them spoke, the silence holding them in place as the light grew brighter, as the figures inside aligned, as the moment Samuel had come for began to take shape just beyond reach, and for the first time, the space between them did not feel like a boundary, it felt like a distance measured not in feet, but in understanding. And neither man had crossed it yet. The music reached its peak and then softened, opening a space that felt almost sacred, the kind of pause that signaled something important was about to be revealed, and inside the church, movement shifted with intention, a figure stepping into the aisle, white fabric catching the light in a way that seemed to glow from within, and even from where he stood, just beyond the threshold, Samuel Whitaker could see it, not clearly, not in full detail, but enough to recognize what he had come for, enough to know that this was the moment he had carried with him across miles and nights and years that had never quite let him rest, and his breath caught, not sharply, but gently, as if he was afraid even the smallest sound might disturb what he was witnessing, and for a second, everything else faded again, the presence of Charles Bennet, the tension that had filled the space, the weight of what had just passed between them, all of it slipping away as Samuel's focus narrowed to that single image, that single figure moving slowly forward, and then something unexpected happened, something neither of them had anticipated. The figure paused, not for long, just long enough to shift the rhythm of the moment, and from inside the church, a subtle ripple moved outward, not loud, not chaotic, but noticeable, like a change in the current of a river that had been flowing smoothly until that instant, and Samuel felt it before he fully understood it, his fingers tightening once more around the invitation, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to see more clearly through the distance, and then the figure turned, not fully, just enough for the light to catch her face. And even from where he stood, there was no mistaking it, no uncertainty left to hold on to, and something inside him stilled completely, not frozen, but anchored, as if the years between them had collapsed into a single point in time, and at that same moment, Charles Bennet noticed it too, the shift in the air, the way attention inside the church seemed to gather around something unexpected, the way a few heads turned slightly toward the entrance, and instinctively, his gaze followed. Drawn to the doorway once more, his posture tightening again, ready to correct, to manage, to restore order if needed, but what he saw did not match any situation he had prepared for, because the bride was no longer moving forward, she was looking outward, her gaze fixed past the rows of guests, past the carefully arranged space, towards something beyond the boundary he had tried so hard to enforce, and that gaze did not waver, did not search, it landed with certainty, and for a fraction of a second, Charles felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not confusion exactly, but the beginning of it, the unraveling of a conclusion he had already decided, and Samuel did not move. Did not call out, did not raise a hand, he simply stood there, meeting that gaze with a quiet steadiness that carried everything he had not said, everything he had not demanded, everything he had chosen to endure instead, and then the distance between them shifted again, not physically, but in meaning, as if the space that had separated them was no longer empty, but filled with recognition, and the bride took a small step forward, not down the aisle, but toward the direction of the door. Her movement subtle but unmistakable, and the music faltered just slightly, the change almost imperceptible but enough to signal that something had broken the expected flow, and Charles felt it then, fully now, the realization forming not as a sudden shock but as a slow, undeniable clarity, the name on the invitation, the way Samuel had held it, the way he had stood there without leaving, without arguing, without demanding entry, and suddenly those details aligned in a way he had not allowed before. And the certainty he had relied on began to dissolve, replaced by something heavier. Something that could not be dismissed or redirected, and Samuel's voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper, not meant to carry, not meant to interrupt, just a single word that held more meaning than anything that had been said before. Olivia! And it was enough, because the moment had already turned, the truth already revealed itself not through declaration, but through recognition, and nothing that came next would return the world to what it had been just seconds before. The word did not need to be loud to be heard, it carried across the space with a quiet certainty that reached its destination without effort, and Olivia Whittaker stopped completely now, no longer shifting, no longer moving forward, her breath catching in a way that was visible even from a distance, her fingers tightening slightly around the small bouquet she held as if grounding herself in something real, something she could control while everything else began to shift beyond expectation, and the room inside the church seemed to follow her stillness. The subtle murmur fading into a silence that was no longer part of the ceremony but part of something deeper, something unplanned, and slowly, almost carefully, Olivia turned fully toward the entrance, her gaze no longer searching but fixed, locked onto the figure standing just beyond the doorway, and in that moment, recognition was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty, and Samuel Whittaker did not move, he did not step forward to close the distance, he did not raise his voice to claim the connection, he simply stood there, holding the invitation at his side now, his posture steady but softened, his eyes reflecting something that had waited far too long to be seen, and Charles Bennett felt the shift land fully, not as a question anymore but as a realization he could not escape, the structure he had relied on dissolving in the face of something that did not follow rules, something that did not respect the boundaries he had enforced, and for the first time that day, his authority did not guide his next action, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to organize, nothing to control, only something to face, and he found himself taking a small step back, not commanded, not intentional, but instinctive, creating space where he had once drawn a line, and Olivia took a step forward, not down the aisle, not toward the life that had been carefully arranged for her, but toward the doorway, toward the man who had remained outside of it, her movements slow but unwavering, each step deliberate as if she was crossing more than just physical distance, as if she was stepping through years of absence, of silence, of things left unsaid, and the light from the doorway wrapped around her as she moved, the white fabric of her dress catching it, reflecting it, blending into it, while outside, Samuel remained still, his breath steadying again as he watched her approach, not with disbelief, not with urgency, but with a quiet acceptance that carried both relief and restraint, and when she reached the threshold, she paused again, just inches from the line that had separated them, her eyes searching his face now, not for confirmation but for understanding, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. But it carried more weight than anything that had been said before. "You came," she said, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as a recognition of effort, of distance, of everything it must have taken for him to stand there at that exact moment, and Samuel nodded once, a small motion, simple, honest. "I told you I would," he replied, his voice steady, grounded in a promise that had survived time and circumstance, and behind them, Charles stood frozen in a different kind of silence now, not one of control but of realization, his gaze shifting between the two of them as the truth settled fully into place, the invitation, the name, the persistence, all of it aligning into something undeniable, something that stripped away every assumption he had made, and he felt it then, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, the weight of having misjudged, of having reduced a man to something less than he was, and for a moment, he did not know what to do with that realization. Because it did not come with instructions, it did not fit into any system he had built, and yet it demanded something from him, something he could not ignore, and slowly, almost carefully, he stepped forward again, but this time not to enforce, not to remove, but to acknowledge, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Sir? He began, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, but necessary. I did not understand. And the admission hung there, incomplete but real, and Samuel glanced toward him briefly, not with anger, not with triumph, just with a calm that carried more grace than any apology could match, before his attention returned to Olivia, because this moment was not about correction, it was about connection, and in that space, something had already changed, something that could not be undone, something that no longer belonged to control, but to truth. The moment held, quiet and complete, as if the world had chosen not to interrupt what had finally found its way back to itself, and Olivia Whittaker stood at the threshold, her hands slowly lowering from the bouquet as if it no longer needed to carry the weight it once did, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face, taking in every line, every detail that time had etched into him, not with shock, not with disbelief, but with a kind of recognition that ran deeper than memory, something that lived beneath it, something that had never truly left, and Samuel did not step forward immediately, he waited, just a second longer, as if giving her the space to choose, to close the distance on her own terms, and when she did, when that final step was taken, it was small, almost quiet, but it carried years within it, and the space between them disappeared not with noise, but with presence, with understanding. Was something that did not need to be explained to anyone else watching, and inside the church, the silence remained, no longer uncertain but respectful, as if everyone present understood, even without knowing the full story, that something more important than a schedule was unfolding right at the edge of the doorway, and Charles Bennet stood just behind them now, no longer at the center of anything, his posture changed in a way that could not be rehearsed, his hands no longer adjusting, no longer directing, simply still at his sides as he watched what he had nearly dismissed, what he had nearly removed, now standing as the most important part of the moment he had been tasked to protect, and the realization settled into him fully, not as a sudden weight, but as a quiet shift, a recalibration of everything he thought he understood about order, about belonging, about what mattered, and Samuel lifted his hand slowly, not reaching immediately, not assuming, just offering it in a gesture that was both tentative and certain, and Olivia did not hesitate, her fingers meeting his, closing around them with a familiarity that did not need to be relearned, and in that contact, something completed itself. Something that had been waiting far longer than this day, far longer than this ceremony, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said, not yet, the silence itself carrying more truth than words could hold, and then Olivia turned slightly, her gaze shifting back toward the aisle, toward the life that was waiting for her just inside, and then back to Samuel. A quiet question passing between them without being spoken, and Samuel understood it, not through words, but through the way she looked at him, through the way her hand remained steady in his, and he nodded once, a small, simple motion that carried permission, support, and something deeper, something that had always been there even when distance tried to erase it, and together, without announcement, without disruption, they stepped forward, not as strangers crossing a boundary, but as something that belonged, something that had always belonged, even when it was unseen, and the light from inside the church wrapped around them as they moved, blending the outside and the inside into a single space, removing the line that had once separated them, and Charles watched as they passed, his gaze lowering briefly to the marble where the invitation had touched the ground earlier, the faint mark barely visible now, already fading, and when he looked up again, they were already moving down the aisle, the music resuming softly. Not exactly as it had before, but adjusted, adapted, as if even it understood that something had changed, and the guests rose slowly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, in respect for a moment that had redefined itself, and Samuel walked beside his daughter, not in the center, not claiming attention, but present in a way that no longer needed permission, his worn shoes stepping quietly against the polished floor, each step steady, each breath even. And Olivia held his hand with quiet strength, her dress trailing behind her, catching the light, reflecting it in soft waves that moved with her, and as they reached the front, she released his hand gently, not as an ending, but as a continuation, a trust that did not need to be held tightly to remain, and Samuel stepped back just slightly, his place clear now, not outside, not removed, but included in a way that could not be undone, and the room settled into a new kind of stillness, one that carried meaning rather than tension, and no one spoke of what had happened, no one needed to, because it was already understood in the quiet, in the way the light moved across the floor, in the way the air felt just a little warmer, a little fuller, and in the way one man stood a little taller than he had before, not because anything had been given to him, but because something had been seen.